Howdy doody, buckaroonie. Welcome back. How's your week been? Tell me all about it. Interesting. Yeah, you know, when that happens to me, I usually just flip them inside out and then wear them for another week, and it tends to sort itself out. Yeah, now I see what you mean. Yeah, not to cut you off, but hey, do you want to learn some cool techniques to design super glitchy percussion loops and learn how to make some interesting percussion sounds using additive synthesis inside of a wavetable synth like Vital? I get asked quite a bit anymore about the little glitchy textures in my music, as well as whenever I'm doing stream stuff or sound design stuff on stream that involves little glitchy things. So today, I wanted to share with you my techniques for creating cool glitchy loops using only a handful of plugins and show you a cool percussion sound design technique that I sort of stumbled upon the other day that I thought was pretty neat and I'm going to be using a lot going forward. If you want to check out the plugins used in this video, you can find them all with the link down in the description below. I know some of them are paid plugins, and you could do this using free stuff, but these plugins really make this a whole lot easier, because otherwise you have to do a lot of this stuff manually, and it's honestly pretty tedious. So this stuff is well worth the investment because it will save you a whole bunch of time. These glitching techniques also go beyond the world of percussion loops and whatnot, so feel free to try applying this to an entire drum bus, your entire mix, a melodic loop, or anything else you see fit, because we're really just going to be dealing with some concepts and some orders of operations rather than exact rigid rules, so feel free to bend and break these ideas as you will and see what you can come up with. Today's episode of Morning Coffee with Cameron is brought to you by Perfect Circuit. Perfect Circuit is one of the best places to get some sweet new gear for your studio. Whether you're looking for a new MIDI controller, a boutique Euro rack module, or just a handful of cables, Perfect Circuit's got you covered with a massive selection of brands and products. Their online support is truly excellent as well, and they're happy to answer any questions you have with your new gear, or help you choose the right tool for the job if you're not totally sure what you're looking for. If you're on the hunt for something new, you can use my affiliate link in the description below to check out Perfect Circuit. You get some sweet new gear, and you get a warm fuzzy feeling by helping to support the channel so I can make more videos like this one. Just to give you an idea of what we're kind of leaning towards here as an end goal for this project, I've created a quick loop which sounds like this. What we're going to be focusing on here today is this stuff. More specifically, these two elements here. What we're going to be doing here is going to be broken down into two parts. Part one, I want to teach you this cool percussion synthesis technique so you can try it out and make some sounds. And then in part two, we're going to be talking about making all those cool little glitchy texture bits. The percussion synthesis technique is pretty cool and is something I sort of accidentally stumbled upon. And in order to avoid any unnecessary bitching and complaining in the comments, we're going to be doing this in Vital. Vital is absolutely free. You can go download it right now to follow along, although I do encourage you to buy the paid version of Vital to help support Matt and the Vital team. To begin, we're going to click the pencil icon here to access the wavetable editor. And then we're going to zoom all the way out on all of these harmonics and phase controls. And we're just going to scrub these down to 0. So we have absolutely nothing inside of here. What we're going to be doing is basically an additive synthesis technique, but we're not really doing anything too precise. We're just gonna scrub in some random points and it's going to start creating some cool percussive type tones. Right now, since we've cleared this out, if I press a note, absolutely nothing happens. So if we look at this way down here and we zoom in on these first few harmonics, we can draw this in and create a sine wave, which looks like this. Sounds a lot like a sine wave. If we zoom way back out here and clear this out, we can start drawing in this area and avoid these first couple of harmonics, because this stuff is really what provides a tone to things. But once we get up into this area, we're really dealing with noise frequencies. It doesn't really sound like all that much. So we're just gonna draw in some random stuff, really doesn't matter, just kind of play around and see what you get. Then we'll go down here and draw randomly just to rotate the phase of each of these partials, just to give us something a little bit more unique. You gotta play around with this a little bit because rotating the phase can pretty significantly impact the tone, so take a little bit of time, but don't worry about it too much. Something like this is basically what we're going for. Now, if we go back in here and drop this first envelope down to something very short, we've now created a pretty cool blippy little percussive sound. By adding in maybe some noise, we get something a bit more natural, but one of my favorite techniques to enhance this is to use ring modulation or phase or frequency modulation, just something to modulate the oscillator with some noise or another oscillator. And that takes it from this to something maybe a little bit more interesting sounding. Now, from here, there are a lot of different things we can do, but one cool thing to know is that by playing different notes, you can get some really varied results. And what I'm doing here is just going all the way down on my keyboard, as far down as it can go, and playing these first couple of notes introduces a lot of different artifacts and things that just sound kind of interesting because we're playing this essentially super high frequency content back at a fairly low frequency. And it sounds pretty interesting. And that's a pretty kind of cool percussive sample. By shortening the attack and introducing maybe a couple of filters, we could do something like a low pass and then a high pass here. Add a little bit of filter drive. And then go in and add some basic effects, maybe a chorus. Some super, super basic filtered delay. Maybe a very, very short delay. Cool, some distortion. And then maybe a hint of reverb just to add a touch of space and dimension to everything. We've got some pretty neat percussive sounds, and this is super easy to modify, so if you like this, but you don't maybe like the sound, we could go in and just start redrawing some harmonics, play with some phase stuff, and quickly get something that sounds very different, and then modify a few effects, and there you go. You could generate a whole bunch of percussion super ultra fast with very low effort. Now, in terms of taking that and turning it into this stuff, there's really not all that much involved. It's a pretty simple technique. So first, I'm gonna show you how I typically do this using Dune. What I've got here is a Dune patch using the same technique. I went in and created a wavetable and just messed with a bunch of partials and phase stuff until I got something that sounded interesting. And then I used the mseg here to create a pattern. If I start getting rid of all of these effects and turn off the effects in Dune, this is the bass sound. Turn that up because it's pretty quiet. So that is the core idea here. And by using different little burst lengths, it's sort of replicating something like a closed hat and an open hat, or maybe a longer percussive hit, or maybe someone damping the percussive block with their hand, or whatever you want to do. Then I played around with some filters and some movement, so I used the LFOs over here with random sample and glide LFOs and assigned that to just a bunch of stuff in the mod matrix. I'm really not doing anything too specific. I'm just trying to get something interesting. So by panning out some of the different oscillators I'm using, like the ring modulation oscillator and the noise oscillator and things like that, moving around these filters and doing that kind of stuff, we've got something pretty solid. Now, in order to get that percussive pattern, what I did here in the mixer is zero out all the faders and then use the mod matrix to use this mseg pattern to raise those faders by different amounts. One cool thing though here, if you wanted to have kind of a bass tone underneath everything, you could raise one of these oscillators just a little bit. And now we've got kind of a blanket tone underneath this. Another cool technique with this would be to use something like another LFO or another mseg here to target the blanket level of that oscillator. So let's route this to mseg 2 here. And we could start to bring this in just a little bit over time with something that's not quite as synced. So let's try that. And let's set this to loop mode. And now we've got something kind of cool. By adding some unison and some detuning as well as some stereo spread in the oscillator section, this can really help this feel a bit wider and more interesting and a bit more authentic. That detuning really helps to emulate the total inharmonicity of the percussive sound. We typically associate percussive things with a lot of complex overtones and harmonics that don't really have a clear relationship to the fundamentals. So by further enhancing that with a bunch of detuning and spreading and stuff, it sounds more like an actual percussive thing. Now, to finish this off, within Dune, I've just added some effects. I've got some distortion here, so I've got a little bit of rate crushing, which is just a sample rate reducer. So that brings it down to something a bit more lo-fi. Also helps enhance that transient a little bit. I've got an EQ enhancing a couple spots. A phaser here. This has got a really high feedback, and we can bring this in. That can be useful just to add some tone and stuff. This is also not moving, but we could add some movement to it. Maybe something like that. A chorus here, just to add some stereo width. Maybe drop that down a bit. I've got both delays inside of Dune here on. These have slightly different timings and feedback amounts. I've changed the mode on each as well, so that just enhances the percussive loop feel. A tiny bit of reverb here just to add some dimension and room and space. And then finally a compressor to tie it all together. We could probably drop that reverb down a bit. And now we've got a pretty cool percussive loop. So if we give this a play, the final result sounds like this. So as you can tell by playing different notes here, we can get a variety of timbres and tones out of that. And this can be especially useful to vary throughout the loop. We could add, a low note, bring it up, and go back down, something like that. Moving on, let's talk about the glitchiness now that we've got the bass thing going on. When it comes to doing all the cool glitchy stuff and whatnot, I find it's about adding a little bit of spice one step at a time. So one of the first things I like to do is just add some interesting tone and flavor. I've already done a lot of that through Dune by adding those different effects. So we've got a pretty interesting sound that has enough dynamics and movement to it to work with, but a couple other things you could try is adding like an EQ. That almost makes it kind of sound like rim shots or snares or something. We could even modulate this EQ. We could add more bands moving around, so we've got like some peaks and notches happening, something like that. Another cool thing to try is things like flangers and delays and phasers and whatnot. Here I've got the kilohertz flanger with extremely high feedback, and then we could just mix this in periodically. It gives you kind of some cool resonant things like that. Routing this before something like another delay could be interesting as well, because then you'll get echoes of the resonating version of the sound blending against the original. Changing the delay time. Anything like that can enhance those weird, glitchy, goofy, percussive vibes that we all know and love. To take these loops from standard percussive loops to interesting glitchy loops, there are really three plugins I always call up to do this. The first two are right here, Replicant 2 and Automaton, both from Audio Damage. The nice thing with these is that they both involve some degree of probability and generativeness, meaning they're a lot less predictable than doing this by hand or using looping effects and things like that. So that's what's cool about these is I could set these up and let this run for, let's say, 4, 8, or even 16 or 32 bars, bounce it down, and I've got something unique. And if I don't like it, I could do it again. Or I could bounce something out maybe 3 or 4 times and chop out the bits I like from each, put them back together, and make one new loop of all the good bits of each occurrence of the loop happening. With Replicant, typically what I do is entirely just use the random beat mode. This way, I'm not selecting the beats, it's just gonna pick random ones every single time and give me something interesting. There's not too much to this, I just play with the settings until something cool starts to happen, especially things like the filter or the panning and things like that, the bit crushing, so on and so forth. I always like to blend these down a bit as well, because if they're too prominent, the loop feels too static. I like it when the glitches and stuff are a little bit quieter than the main loop, so you hear that it's more of an auxiliary element and not necessarily the focus of the loop. Automaton, I do much the same here. I'll just go in, mess with the settings, plunk in a couple dots here on the Game of Life grid, let it run, and then I'll just set this to mix mode and drop the level a little bit so that everything is just happening sort of in the background. When you put both of these effects on that same loop, it takes it to this. Let's change this one to mix mode. And bring them up a little bit. And there you can hear a lot of cool little glitches and things happening. Putting this one on duck mode though, we're entirely hearing just the glitches from Replicant, and then those glitches are being re-glitched inside of Automaton. So that starts to sound really kind of chaotic and weird. The third plugin I like to use for this stuff is, of course, my good friend, Infiltrator. To quickly walk you through how I did this layer, I've got a simple sound in Vital, made using the same technique. It just had kind of a nice liquidy character to it. To get this moving and to sound more like a sequence, I used velocity here and tied it to filter 2's cutoff, and then I used an arpeggiator in DAWg with some varied velocity and gate lengths to turn that into a sequence. Now, I've got another plugin here that's kind of interesting, adding some movement. This is UVI Shade, and what I like to do is just call up a random preset. Shade's got a bunch of crazy presets in it, so this is a pretty fun one to create some glitchy, weird things with. This just adds a lot of interesting movement and phasiness. And just help to enhance that sort of liquidy character I've got going on. Infiltrator comes in and totally wrecks this in some pretty cool ways. I've already covered Infiltrator in a good degree on the channel before. If you want to check that video out, you can. But basically, I'll just flick through some presets or design some new presets because Infiltrator is just super easy to use and make some kind of thing. In this case, I called up one of my own presets, which are part of the factory presets here, and that just enhanced a little bit of that liquidiness with those filter movements. But it's also got some cool digital edge with all the bit crushy bits and things like that. Now, the thing with Infiltrator is it's based on the sequence here. So it's not really generating new ideas, it's a continuous loop. So to break that up and make it a bit more interesting, I brought in a replicant after that, and now we've got kind of a generative layer on top of the predictable layer of glitchiness. I've set this to duck mode as well, so we're only hearing the glitches, we're not getting the dry signal through it. And this starts to sound a lot more interesting. From here, typically it's a good idea to bring in some kind of EQ just to clean things up. Sometimes with these effects, you can get some weird sub stuff coming through. And you might want to take out kind of the mid-range percussiveness of this and turn it more into like a hat loop, so you could easily just filter this out. Enhance the high end a little. And there you would have a pretty decent hat loop thing, but in this case, we kind of want that full beans, everything sound. Finally, one cool trick is to add a disperser. This can really make things sound sort of weird and goofy. Disperse is a great plugin. If you don't own it, you really should. With that, we've taken what was a random, super weird harmonic wavetable thing and turned it into a cool percussive layer with a bunch of glitchy stuff. And that really well suits some of these types of, you know, groovy, psychedelic type tracks, or if you're doing something maybe involving IDM or whatever, this is another really good tool to have in your toolkit just to make some interesting percussive loops and whatnot. And that's really all there is to it. There are a number of ways you could expand on or experiment with this technique. You could try using some sampled loops and throwing them through these glitching plugins and seeing what happens. You could take some of your favorite samples and put them in a drum machine and play a pattern and run them through these and see what happens. You could try a melody through this, or you could disregard all of this because you think it's stupid and you want to try something else entirely, but in any case, maybe you get something cool out of it. As with most things in the world of sound design, I find that this is equal parts experimentation and a little bit of knowing what you're doing, and I think it really comes down to just some creative post-processing and trying some techniques, and especially pairing things that are predictable with things that are unpredictable, and that can really help steer you in the direction of something a bit more interesting and creative that stands out to you. And that's pretty much my entire approach to making glitchy percussive loops for my own music or for sample packs when I'm working on those, and I think it's a pretty easy way of going about doing it. With just a handful of plugins, you can really transform something pretty basic and uninspiring into something pretty neat sounding. And that wraps it up for this one. If you know some other tools or techniques for creating cool glitchy percussive loops or whatever, feel free to share those down in the comments. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And as always, I hope this inspires you to get out there and make something awesome.